Winter, 1913, Nahanni Valley, Northwest Territories, Canada. 4 constables of the Royal Northwest Mounted Police entered that valley on a welfare check. 3 did not come out the same way they went in. 1 did not come out at all. The official report said exposure and terrain. The surviving officer's private account, filed separately and sealed for 31 years, said something else entirely. Something that watched from the ridgeline for 3 days before it moved closer. Something that left tracks no animal in any naturalist's catalogue had any business making. By the 6th day, they understood they were not investigating a disappearance. By the 9th day, they understood they were becoming one. This is what happened during the 11 days Constable Patrol Folio 7 Mackenzie District spent in the South Nahanni watershed before the valley took its toll. Subscribe for more true historical horror stories. My name is Elias Drum. I am 74 years old, and I live now in a small house on the outskirts of Fort Smith in the Northwest Territories, not 300 miles from where this happened. I have lived close to that country my whole life, because leaving felt like surrendering something I was not ready to give up. I do not know if that was stubbornness or something the valley put inside me. I have thought about that for 60 years, and I still cannot answer it cleanly. I arrived at Fort Leard on the 14th of November 1913, 3 weeks out of Edmonton. Having ridden and walked the last 240 miles in conditions that would qualify today as an emergency, the temperature was -22 Fahrenheit when we made the post. Corporal August Hennig met us at the gate, a square-built man in his late 40s with a jaw like a quarried stone and a manner so flat and practical you could have used him for a table. He gave us hot tea and then told us why we were there. 2 prospectors, named Braun and Sutter, had gone into the South Nahanni drainage in late September to work a gravel claim they'd staked the previous spring. They were due back by the 1st of November. It was now the 14th, and they had not returned, sent no word, and the DNA trappers who ran lines along the lower river had come to the post 12 days earlier with their own concerns. The trappers said they had found Braun and Sutter's camp, standing empty. Not abandoned in the manner of men who had left in an orderly fashion, standing empty in the manner of a place where men had simply ceased to be. Gear left mid-task, a pot still sitting over a cold fire. The trappers had not gone further upriver. When Corporal Hennig asked why, the oldest among them said a word in slavey I did not know then. I looked it up years later. It means, roughly, the thing that has always been here. The patrol was 4 men, Corporal Hennig leading. Constable Dowd, a rangy man from Manitoba, who had come up through the cavalry division and moved through the bush like he'd been built for it. Constable Pierre Beaulieu, a Métis man in his 30s who had grown up on the Mackenzie and knew the country better than any of us, better than Hennig, though Hennig would not admit it plainly. And me, Elias Drum, Constable 2nd Class, 23 years old, assigned to the Mackenzie District 8 months prior, still learning what cold meant up here compared to what cold had meant in Saskatchewan. We left Fort Leard on the 16th of November with a dog team of 7 and supplies for 14 days. The river ice was solid enough for travel. Pierre said it had been an early freeze, the earliest he could remember. And he said it in the way you note a fact that unsettles you, without wanting to give it more weight than it deserves. We made good time the first 2 days. 22 miles the first day, 18 the second. The valley narrows considerably above the second canyon, and the walls rise on both sides to maybe 1,500 feet. In summer, I am told, it is almost beautiful. In November 1913, It was a corridor. We found Braun and Sutter's camp on the afternoon of the third day, November 18th. It was, as the Diné trappers had described, which is to say, it was wrong in the way that takes a moment to register, because at first glance, everything appears to be in order. And then your eye catches one thing, and then another, and the accumulation of small wrongnesses assembles into something that sits badly in your stomach. The tent was standing and intact. The stove inside was cold, but not long cold, Pierre estimated, meaning it had been burning within the week. 2 bedrolls were laid out, which told us the men had been sleeping there up until recently. A frying pan sat on the camp stove with grease that had congealed and then been disturbed, dragged through in lines like fingers had been pulled through it. Braun's logbook was open on the supply crate to an entry dated November 9th. The entry stopped mid-sentence. Dowd read it aloud. Heard it again on the East Ridge, 3rd night running. Not a wolf, not a bear, something that... And then the sentence ended. Corporal Hennig made a note in his patrol folio and said the men had likely moved upriver to a secondary camp. Pierre did not say anything, but I watched him look at the tent, look at the logbook, look at Dowd, and then look at the East Ridge. He looked at the East Ridge for a long time. When I asked him later what he had been thinking, he said he had been trying to remember a story his grandfather told him about this drainage. He did not volunteer what the story contained, and I did not press him. We established our own camp a quarter-mile downriver from the prospector's site. Hennig's decision. Practical reasoning. We would begin systematic searches of both banks and upriver approaches starting the following morning. We had 7 dogs, all experienced on the river routes, well-fed, solid animals. That first night at the Nahanni camp, they did not bark. They did not howl or fight among themselves the way trail dogs do when they are restless. They pressed together against the far side of their tether line and pointed their noses toward the East Ridge and did not make a sound. I took first watch, 2 to 4 in the morning. The temperature had dropped to around -30. The moon was in its last quarter and gave enough light to read the ridgeline above the east bank. I watched it for 2 hours. I did not see anything. But there was a period of approximately 40 minutes, somewhere around 3 in the morning, when the wind stopped entirely and the valley went so quiet that I could hear the river moving under the ice. And in that quiet, I became aware of a sound on the ridge that I could not immediately identify. It was periodic, not rhythmic like a machine, not random like settling timber. Periodic in the way a thing is periodic when it is choosing to be, when it is pausing and then continuing. I could not determine a source distance with any accuracy in those conditions. I reported it to Hennig when he relieved me. He said it was probably ice cracking on the cliff face. I wrote it down in my own notes as ridge sound, source unclear, duration approximately 40 minutes, ceased without explanation. The 19th was a full search day. We split into pairs, Hennig with me and Pierre with Dowd, working a grid pattern out from the prospector's camp. We found the second camp at 11 in the morning, about a mile upriver on the east bank. Braun and Sutter had clearly been using it as a working base while they tested the gravel beds higher up. It showed signs of regular occupation through what we estimated was mid-October. After that, nothing. No sign of the men themselves, no blood, no clothing, no gear beyond what they'd left at the main camp. The ground was frozen hard enough that tracking was mostly useless, but Pierre found something on the bank above the second camp that he called us to look at. Impressions in the bank, where the ground had been softer before the hard freeze, now locked in place. 5 of them in a rough line, spaced irregularly, each one roughly oval in shape and between 14 and 17 inches in length. Pierre measured them with a folding rule from his kit. Depth varied. The deepest was just over 3 inches into what had been soft ground. Pierre said, quiet and matter-of-fact, that the spacing and depth suggested something walking on 2 legs. Dowd pointed out that the impressions did not show toe marks of any distinct pattern, no claw drag, no heel definition you would expect from a human boot. Hennig looked at them for a while and wrote track impressions, unidentified, possibly human, possibly animal, possibly frost distortion in his folio, and called it done. Pierre looked at me sideways, and I understood the look. We returned to camp at dusk, around 4 in the afternoon at that latitude in November. Supper was salt pork and biscuits and tea, which had been every supper and would be every supper for the duration. Pierre was quiet through the meal in a way that was different from his usual quiet, which was the comfortable quiet of a man who does not need to fill space with words. This was a listening quiet, a measuring quiet. After the meal, Dowd asked him directly what was on his mind. Pierre considered for a moment and said his grandfather had told him that the Nahanni drainage had always been regarded by the local Dine as belonging to something that was here before people were here. Not a spirit in the religious sense, he was careful to say, not what the missionaries meant when they talked about spirits, something physical, something old. Something that tolerated passage through its territory on its own terms, and when those terms were violated, did not tolerate it further. Hennig said the Dine had lots of stories, and that the prospectors were probably 30 miles upriver, having a fine time and not thinking about us at all. Pierre said maybe. The night of the 19th was the first night the dogs made noise, not barking. Not the kind of noise you expect from dogs detecting a bear or another predator. It began around midnight, and it was a sound I had never heard from a dog before, and have not heard since. Low, sustained, coming from deep in the chest, not from the throat. All 7 animals simultaneously. Pierre was up before any of us, standing at the tent entrance, listening. Dowd was behind him with his rifle. The sound the dogs were making went on for approximately 4 minutes and then stopped. And when it stopped, the valley went into that same total silence I had noticed the previous night. And then, from the east ridge, came an answer. I will try to describe this accurately, because I wrote it down within the hour, and I am reading from those notes now, 60 years later. The sound from the ridge was vocalization. I say vocalization because it was clearly produced by a living thing using a respiratory system. It was not a howl, not a roar, not any sound in the catalogue of northern wildlife I had been trained to identify. It had modulation. It rose and fell with a pattern that I can only describe as deliberate. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds. It ceased. The dogs did not resume their sound. They moved as a group to the far end of their tether line and lay flat on the snow, and did not move until morning. Hennig said it was a wolf with a respiratory infection affecting the sound of the howl. Dowd said nothing. Pierre went back to his bedroll and lay with his eyes open until dawn. I wrote it in my notes. Ridge vocalization, not catalogued. Modulation suggesting deliberate pattern. Dogs non-reactive after initial response. Duration, approximately 30 seconds. The 20th, we spent the full day searching and found nothing new beyond what we had already catalogued. The temperature dropped again to around -35 by our thermometer at camp, which meant working conditions were at the outer edge of what the regulations considered acceptable for continued patrol activity. Hennig pushed us through it. We were 7 days from Fort Leard, and the prospectors were still unaccounted for. We moved camp upriver 2 miles to a more sheltered bend where the spruce grew thicker and the wind came less directly off the north face. The new camp position put the east ridge farther away, about 400 yards across the river. Pierre noted the distance and said nothing else. That night I was on watch from midnight to 2. The temperature by my reading was -38. The moon had set, and the darkness was the total darkness you only get that far north, that far from any settlement, in the deep of winter. I sat with the lantern turned low to preserve the oil and watched the ice. At approximately 12:40 in the morning, the dogs gave their first sound of the night. Again the low, sustained chest vocalization, and I moved to where I could see them and followed their orientation to find what they were looking at. There was something on the ice. The opposite bank was perhaps 70 feet away at that point in the river. The ice was white-gray in the ambient light from the snow. The thing on the ice was not white-gray. It was darker than the surrounding surface, and it was large. And it was on 2 legs, and it was standing still. I could not make out detail at that distance, in that light. I could determine upright posture, considerable height, which I estimated at the time as between 7 and 9 feet. Breadth of shoulder that was not consistent with human proportion. And it was not moving. It was standing at the far bank, and it was oriented toward our camp, and it was absolutely still. I woke Corporal Hennig. He came to the tent entrance and looked and did not speak for a full minute. Then he said, "How long has it been standing there?" I said I did not know. It was there when I looked. He watched it for another 2 minutes in silence. Then he turned back to the tent and said, "Wake the others," which I did. All 4 of us stood at the tent entrance and watched the thing on the ice. It did not move during the approximately 11 minutes we observed it before the temperature forced us back inside. Hennig said, "Large animal, the ice plays tricks with size at night. We will examine the bank at first light." Pierre said evenly, "It was not a bear." Hennig said he was not saying it was a bear. Pierre said, "That is good." Nobody said anything else. First light on the 21st. We crossed to the east bank before breakfast. Pierre found the place where it had stood. No snow disturbance from an approach which Pierre said was consistent with the animal moving on the ice itself, where the frozen surface would show less compression. Where it had stood on the bank, there were 2 depressions in the snow at the base of the cut bank, each roughly matching the oval dimensions of the impressions we had found at the prospector's second camp, spaced apart in a stance width that Pierre measured at 31 inches. The depth in the snow was just over 2 inches on the left impression, 4 inches on the right, meaning it had been standing with slightly more weight forward on its right, meaning it had been looking at something across the river, meaning it had been standing watching our camp the way a man stands and watches a thing he is considering. Corporal Hennig spent a long time looking at those impressions. He wrote 6 lines in his patrol folio, and then closed it. He did not share what he had written. He said we would continue the search for Braun and Sutter and make a decision about the patrol extension at the end of the day. Pierre asked him, quietly and without confrontation, what he intended to write in his official report. Hennig said he would write what the evidence supported. Pierre said, "Yes, Corporal. We found Braun on the afternoon of the 21st, or what remained that identified him as Braun, which was his coat, with his name written inside in his wife's hand, a documented habit of his, and the contents of his coat pockets. He was 1.4 miles upriver from the main camp on the east bank, at the base of a cliff face where the terrain offered a natural alcove. He had been there for some time. The cold had preserved what the exposure had not. There was no question of violence from another human party. There was no question of a fall. What I observed, and what I wrote in my notes, and what Corporal Hennig recorded in his folio, matched in all particulars, and I will not describe those particulars here, except to say, whatever had found Braun was very large, and was not eating him. It had moved him to that alcove. I have spent 60 years trying to find an interpretation of that fact that settles me. I have not found one. Hennig called us back from the site and spoke in his level, carrying voice. He said we would camp the night and leave at first light on the 22nd. He said we had found one man, that the other's location was unknown, and that search conditions were beyond what the patrol resources could safely maintain. This was true. It was also not the complete reason. We all knew the complete reason, and nobody required it to be stated. Pierre made something that I remember as the most understated remark in my experience of human communication. He said, "Corporal, it brought him there on purpose." Hennig looked at him. Pierre said, "It moved him from where it happened to where we would find him. It wanted us to find him." Hennig said, "Pack what you need to. We leave at 0500. That afternoon, on the return to camp, Dowd and I were walking point while Hennig and Pierre managed the dogs. We came around a bend in the river trail, and I saw something that I have never adequately described to another person, because the words available do not carry the specific quality of wrongness it produced. On the ridgeline above the east bank, perhaps 300 feet up and moving east along the ridge, was a shape that I will describe only as follows. It was upright. It was moving in long, unhurried strides that covered ground at a pace inconsistent with human walking even in ideal conditions. And it was moving parallel to our direction of travel, keeping pace with us, not approaching, not retreating, parallel. Matching our speed, Dowd grabbed my arm and pointed, and then said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. We watched it move along the ridge for approximately 90 seconds before the tree line at the ridge's edge blocked our view of it. We stood in place until Hennig and the dog team caught up with us. We told him what we had seen. He looked up at the ridge and wrote in his folio and said, "We will keep moving." The rest of that afternoon was the longest sustained tension I have experienced. We were moving at the pace the dogs could manage on the return trail, which was good pace, steady. The animals were motivated in the direction away from the upper valley, I can tell you that, plainly. Every few minutes, one of us looked up at the east ridge, and every few minutes we saw nothing, and every few minutes we then looked at each other and resumed walking. Pierre was at the rear, watching our back trail and the ridge both. He had his rifle out and carried it, which was against trail practice with dogs because it slows your ability to manage harness. Pierre carried it anyway, and Hennig did not say anything about it. We made our camp at the sheltered bend and began the work of a cold weather overnight. Routine, the reassurance of routine. Feeding the dogs, setting the stove, cooking the meal, running the lamp, things that occupy the hands while the mind is occupied elsewhere. Supper was salt pork and biscuits and tea, and nobody complained, and nobody talked much. Pierre asked Hennig what he was going to write about Braun. Hennig said, "Death by misadventure in extreme terrain conditions." Pierre said, "And the impressions?" Hennig said, "Unidentified animal sign, inconclusive." Pierre said, "And what we saw on the ridge." Hennig picked up his tea and drank it and set it down and said, "We leave at 0500. I was not on watch that night. I was trying to sleep. I was managing intermittent success, the particular broken sleep of a man whose body knows something is wrong even when his eyes are closed. At some point I came awake, fully and immediately, and did not know why. The camp was quiet, the dogs were quiet, the stove was doing its work. Hennig was on watch outside, and then I understood what had woken me, which was the absence of sound from outside that should have been present. Hennig was a man who moved, who shifted his weight, who occasionally cleared his throat on watch. There was none of that. I got up. I pulled on my coat and pushed out through the tent flap. Hennig was standing at the edge of the lantern's light with his back to me. He was completely still. I said his name. He did not respond immediately. When I said it a second time, he turned, and his face was the face of a man who had just seen the bottom of something he had not known had a bottom. He said, very quietly, it was standing on the bank directly across the river, not moving, just watching. And then it did something. He stopped. I asked him what it did. He looked back out at the dark river for a long time, and then he said, it raised one arm, like it was waving, or like it was pointing at us. He was quiet again. Then, get some sleep, Drum. I'll wake the others at 4. I did not sleep. I lay in my bedroll and listened to the valley until 4 in the morning, which was when Hennig woke us as he said he would, and we broke camp in the dark and were on the trail by 4:50. We did not eat breakfast. Nobody suggested we should. The dogs were already in harness, already pulling before Hennig gave the command, straining in the direction of the lower valley, the direction of Fort Liard, the direction of away. We made the first canyon by midday. The valley widened and the walls fell back, and Pierre, who had been at the rear all morning, moved up alongside me and said quietly, it followed us to the first canyon. I asked him how he knew. He said he had seen it twice on the East Ridge, moving parallel, keeping our pace. He said it had stopped at a particular point on the ridge, a rocky promontory above the canyon entrance, and had stood there watching us pass below. He said he thought it was watching to make sure we were leaving. I asked him if he thought it would follow us past the canyon. Pierre considered this for a moment. Then he said, no, that canyon is where its territory ends, I think. It was making sure we understood that. Dowd heard this exchange and said nothing for a while. Then he said, where's Sutter? Pierre said, I think the answer to that question is why it moved Braun where we would find him. Dowd took a long breath of cold air and said, an accounting. Pierre said, something like that. We cleared the second canyon by late afternoon and made camp at a position we had used on the inbound journey. It was 10 miles from Fort Liard. 10 miles. The dogs lay down and slept immediately, which was the first time on the return journey they had shown anything like normal behavior. Hennig made tea and sat with his folio open and wrote for approximately 40 minutes without stopping. I have never seen him write like that, before or since. When he closed the folio, he caught me watching and looked at me for a moment and then said, write down what you remember tonight, Drum. Write down exactly what you saw and exactly what you measured. Keep it separate from your patrol notes. We reached Fort Liard at mid-morning on November 23rd. The patrol had lasted 9 days in the field. We had found one of the 2 missing prospectors and brought out what remained of him, which required a separate notation in the duty record. Sutter was never found. The official report, which I saw before it was filed, attributed Braun's death to exposure and fall injury consistent with the terrain, and Sutter's absence to probable similar cause in conditions precluding recovery. The unidentified animal sign was noted as a sub-paragraph and attributed to possible wolverine or predatory bear activity. which, given the measurements recorded in the folio, was either a conclusion arrived at in extraordinary ignorance of wolverine and bear anatomy, or was arrived at by deliberate choice. I believe it was the latter. I believe Hennig made a decision about what the record needed to say and what the record needed to leave out, and I believe he made it for practical reasons that I respect, even if I have never fully agreed with them. The valley was officially noted as hazardous terrain, unsuitable for individual prospecting operations without armed escort, and a recommendation was made to the territorial commissioner that claims in the South Nahanni drainage above the first canyon be subject to additional welfare check requirements. I do not know if that recommendation was ever acted on. What I know is that men continued to go into the South Nahanni and continued, periodically, to not come back out. The newspapers in Edmonton and Ottawa began calling it Headless Valley sometime in the 1920s, after a different set of remains was found under circumstances nobody in authority was willing to characterize in print. The name stuck. It is the name people use now when they talk about the Nahanni, and they say it like it is mildly interesting and a little romantic, the way people talk about things they have never been close to. I left the mounted police in 1921, having served 8 years. I married a woman from Fort Providence named Clara Tetzo in 1924, and we had 2 children. Both grown now with their own children. I worked river transport through the 30s and 40s and retired in Fort Smith in 1958. I have made a decent, quiet life. I have not returned to the upper Nahanni. I will not. Corporal August Hennig died in 1939. Constable Dowd died of a stroke in Winnipeg in 1952. Pierre Beaulieu outlived us all except me, dying in 1968 in Yellowknife, and before he died, he gave his account of the 1913 patrol to a researcher from the University of Alberta, who was documenting oral histories of the Mackenzie district. I do not know what became of that recording, but I was told about it by Pierre's daughter. She said her father had described the thing on the ridge in more detail than I ever heard him give to any of us during the patrol itself. She said he had described a shape that, in silhouette, was recognizable as a large biped heavier in the shoulders than any man, moving with a fluid economy that he called wrong, in the way that a reflection is wrong when it moves slightly ahead of the thing casting it. She said her father had said, it was not wrong in the way of a thing that should not exist. It was wrong in the way of a thing that has existed for so long, it no longer needs to look right to us. There is a name in the Diné tradition that I have come across in my reading in the 60 years since 1913. Not the word the trapper used at Fort Liard, which I told you means the thing that has always been here. A different name. A name used specifically for the upper Nahanni drainage and the creature associated with the disappearances in that valley. The name in English translation means, approximately, the keeper of the dead water. I am not a man given to folklore. I am not a man who puts stock in names assigned to things by people living under pre-modern conditions, with limited frameworks for explaining what they observed. But I will say this about that name, it is accurate. The river up there has a quality, a stillness, and a pressure that is unlike any other water I have traveled. And whatever kept the upper valley, whatever moved through those ridgelines and stood on that ice and raised its arm toward us in what I have never been able to characterize as anything other than acknowledgement, it treated that valley as possession, and it treated us as trespassers on a kind of sufferance that had limits. We reached those limits. We were permitted to leave. Braun was not. I am 74 years old, and I am writing this in November, the same month 60 years removed. And when I finish writing, I'm going to set it aside and not look at it again. My daughter thinks I am writing my memoirs. That is near enough to the truth. What I am actually doing is putting the weight of it somewhere outside my own head, because I have carried it for 6 decades, and I find I am tired of being the only place it lives. The Nahanni Valley was designated a National Park Reserve in 1972. People go there now on guided canoe trips in the summer. They photograph the waterfalls and camp on the gravel bars, and some of them, I am told, go looking for the mystery with that particular tourist's excitement that comes from thinking a mystery is a story and not a fact. I wish them no harm. I wish them good weather and good water, and an uneventful passage. I wish for them exactly the kind of trip that ends with photographs and a story to tell, that stays manageable in the telling. But the Upper Valley has its own wishes, and it has had them since before there were men to record them, and it will have them long after the last canoe trip is paddled and the last park warden locks the gate for winter. Some rivers run through land that belongs to something else. Some territories were measured out before we arrived and will still be measured out after we are gone. The thing that walks the east ridgeline of the South Nahanni above the Second Canyon has been walking them since before the Dene came to the Mackenzie country, and it will walk them when the Dene are a memory, and the mounted police are a photograph, and I am a name in a folio that nobody opens anymore. We left. It stayed. That is how these things end. The valley always wins.